Unconventional Soldier, a military podcast brought to you by two British Army veterans in association with ISAR.com.
Welcome to the Unconventional Soldier podcast. Our guest today is Zach Allred, a former US Army Ranger who served with 75th Ranger Regiment. For those that don't know, this regiment is a lethal, agile and flexible force capable of conducting many complex joint special operations missions. They are the US Army's premier direct action raid capability. Each of the Ranger battalions is always combat ready, mentally and physically tough, and prepared to fight globally. Their capabilities include airborne and air assault operations, such as seizing key terrain, such as airfields, destroying strategic facilities, capturing or killing enemy combatants, and reconnaissance. The regiment remains an all-volunteer force with an extensive screening and selection process, followed by combat-focused training. On this episode, we'll cover the unit's history, the role in the past and in the present, the selection process, and operational deployments. And as always, we'll finish off with Desert Island Dits with Zach's choice of book, film, and luxury item. So Zach, thank you for coming on the pod. And as usual, we'll start off with our guest's backstory and how you ended up serving in the Rangers. So take the journey.
Thanks for having me on, guys. So, man, I kind of, grew up kind of always admiring the military and, reading a lot about history, about the U.S. Army and like World War II. I was really big into World War II history. And then around 12, 13, I don't know how I, looked into it, but I was like, I want to join the Army. I want to go SF. And, that was kind of what I pursued for a little bit. And then I realized that it takes a little bit more to get into SF straight out of high school. I wasn't interested in waiting around and being in a regular Army unit. And then I learned about Army Rangers and how you could get into a special operations unit pretty quickly with a relatively shorter selection process, and you could be deployed, very quickly after that. And that's what I was, initially interested me in the regiment. And then obviously learning about its history was really cool for me. And then just the challenge of it was what really got me.
Were you aware of things like Black Hawk Down around about this time? Is that sort of the modern iteration of Rangers? Mm-hmm. Was that firmly at the front of your mind?
Oh, I mean, a little bit. I want to say that it took me a while. I think I'd already signed my contract before I saw the movie, but I was familiar with the Battle of Mogadishu, and kind of grew up hearing about the actions in the GWAT. Like I was a later and joined later in the GWAT, so I kind of knew about Rangers' involvement in some higher profile raids and whatnot. During like the early years of that.
So why the Army? Have you got family history with the armed forces? Yeah,
so both of my grandfathers served. My maternal grandfather, he served at the end of World War II. He enlisted right towards the end and was fortunate enough to not be involved in any super heavy fighting. He was initially slated to go to Japan before they dropped the bombs. And then he ended up getting sent to Europe, and he was an engineer. So he helped kind of rebuild and was involved with the rebuilding process in Germany before he was discharged. And then my paternal grandfather was a medic during the Korean War, and he didn't really like to talk about his time there. He was pretty quiet about it, and the whole family really doesn't know a whole lot about it. So it might be safe to assume that he saw some stuff that he just wasn't super comfortable with. And then way back into the 1800s, I'm related to Lord Horatio Nelson. So it's cool that I'm on a British podcast with that kind of lineage.
You're making me and Kev look like poor relations in comparison there, Zach.
we are poor relations, Colin.
You mentioned earlier you want to be a Ranger from quite early on, but what was driving you to that selection process?
Honestly, like I said before, it was the challenge of it. It was the fact that I kind of had a desire to go and see, conflict on some level. And I was like, the surefire way to get there is with Ranger Regiment. And, they have a really high survivability rate. Like, with our medical program, like every Ranger that's injured that can survive is going to survive, based on how well trained our medics are and how well trained everyone else in the assault force is. So I was like, all right, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it right, and go with an elite unit. And I wasn't going to settle for washing out or for quitting to go to a regular leg unit or a regular airborne unit where I knew that they weren't going to deploy and see much. So that was probably my main motivation.
Okay, and I know listening to your podcast, and we'll talk about where people can listen to them later on, but I gather from your podcast you're extremely motivated. I mean, you're a track athlete at school. 400 metres, I think, was your speciality. Was that correct?
Yeah.
But I remember you saying outside track season you were training with a rucksack, and you even got a pipe made up to simulate a rifle, but twice the weight, probably more on M60 weight than a M16 weight. And so you're obviously highly motivated, and just tell that story you mentioned on your podcast about the Special Forces guy that saw you running out with a ruck one day.
Yeah, so through my senior year of high school, I followed the official, I guess, Ranger Assessment Selection Program, prep. And it calls for about 2 rucks a week, one a shorter one and like a longer one. And I had an old Alice pack with about 45 pounds, and then I would throw Camelback in there, and then I had some metal shelving pieces that were all taped together. And yeah, like you said, it was about 15, 16 pounds, so about double the weight of a rifle. And I was on the back stretch on, I think, one of my shorter ones. I don't really remember. But I saw this truck coming up on the other side of the road, and then he did a quick UE, and I was like, oh man, this guy's going to have something to say to me. And it was a 19th Special Forces guy, because I was out in Utah at the time, and there's a National Guard SF unit. And so he gave me a quick talk. He's like, hey man, like, what are you out here training for? Because obviously, like, I was young, like I looked young and probably was wearing something wrong. And he's like, all right, that guy's not in, but he's out there, rucking around. Like, that guy's doing something for something. And he kind of was just talking to me. I was like, yeah, I got a Ranger contract, and I'm going, in the summer. And he was like, good, that's good stuff. He's like, you should try out for SF though. And I was like, yeah, maybe, I don't know. But it was a little bit of motivation to have contact with someone who was already in doing that kind of stuff, and to get, motivation from them, which I thought was cool that he would take the time to talk to someone like me.
Yeah, that's pretty good. And you mentioned there he was, Special Forces, but the American Army or American Forces divide their special operations and special forces into tiers, and there's tier 1, tier 2. Where do the Rangers sit in that tier system?
They sit at tier 2. There is an element within the Ranger Regiment that is tier 1, but we're tier 2.
And tier 1 tends to be SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force, if I'm correct. Is that right?
Yep. And then for Rangers, it's the Regimental Reconnaissance Company, or RRC. And they're a pretty small group. There's not really a whole lot out about them, just because they are so small. But they're technically designated as a tier 1 asset.
We'll get onto the selection process in a minute, but I just think probably wise that we just cover a bit of the history. So most people have heard of the Rangers, which is a proud lineage all the way back to the Revolutionary War and, of course, World War II. Listeners will be familiar with the battle fought in Mogadishu by Task Force Ranger, which I think was 3rd Battalion of 75th Ranger Regiment.
Yep.
That was made famous in the film Black Hawk Down. And of course, you've got operations during the Global War on Terror. I can't even say it. Global War on Terror, which Zach referred to earlier as GWAT. And there's some epic engagements. That is the battle at Takur, also known as Roberts Ridge, during Operation Anaconda can attest. And that's my book choice later on, so we'll cover that battle in a bit more depth towards the end of the podcast. So Zach, over to you then as a resident expert about a little bit of the history of the unit leading up to its present day incarnation.
Yeah, for sure. So we're very particular about our history. Like, it's part of our selection process actually is a history test, which is kind of interesting. And you're kind of expected to know a lot. So we do have a long and proud lineage, and we go all the way back to the American Revolution, and a little bit prior to that with a man named Robert Rogers, who's considered to be like the forefather of the Ranger Regiment. And he was technically a Brit as well. So, there's another homage to y'all. And he served during the French and Indian Wars. And he came up with some standing orders and some rules for ranging that are still, part of our, like in our blue book and in the Ranger handbook with his 19 standing orders.
Strangely enough, when I was in the jungle many years ago, we still used those same rules for jungle warfare. Because we just adapted them, and they were taught on the jungle course as well, because they're still as applicable today as they were then.
One of the big ones is don't be sleeping during dawn. So like when you're in a patrol base, like I think it's pretty common for even an outside of Ranger units to have a stand to before morning nautical twilight and end evening nautical twilight. And then after that, we had some Rangers that were, I guess, Rangers in the Civil War. And the most notorious of that was Francis Marion, or the Swamp Fox, who was down in South Carolina and carried out guerrilla-style attacks on Union troops. And then the first real incarnation of the Ranger battalions today actually came about in 1942 in Ireland, with the standing up of 1st Ranger Battalion. And it was very closely modeled after the British commandos of the time and like the predecessors to the SAS. And 1st Ranger Battalion was actually the first group of Americans to see combat in World War II in North Africa. After they had their successes, they stood up 3rd and 4th Ranger Battalions, and they also saw action across North Africa and into Italy. And then 1st and 3rd were out, like, just killed off during the Battle of Cisterna in Italy in 1944 before they made it into the rest of mainland Europe. And then you had 2nd and 5th battalions, which are kind of famous for their role in D-Day. And that's where one of our mottos comes from, Rangers Lead the Way. And 2nd Battalion, of course, is famous for seizing Point du Hoc in a pretty gnarly battle there, where they scaled a cliff face straight into machine gun fire. And then you have 6th Ranger Battalion, who served in the Pacific. They're the only Ranger Battalion that was in the Pacific. And one of their most famous exploits was the freeing of American POWs who had survived the Bataan Death March in the Combatants raid, which was like, I want to say it was like a 30 or 40 mile walk in and then a 30 or 40 mile walk out. So just absolute, just tough mission. And then there was Ranger companies in Korea. They didn't have a whole lot to do in that conflict, I want to say. And then in Vietnam, there were 15 companies of Rangers who were attached to, I think, regular infantry battalions, and they carried out more like the long range reconnaissance and raids. And then after Vietnam, they decided to formally install or stand back up, I guess, Ranger battalions. And so they stood up 1st Ranger Battalion and 3rd Ranger Battalion. And then 2nd came along after, which came first? It was Grenada, when the successes of 1st and 3rd were kind of well televised and well talked about. And so, and that's the current configuration today, with 3 line battalions, headquarters element, and then we just stood up a few years ago a military intelligence battalion.
So if you're ever across in Europe, Zach, Point du Hoc's well worth a visit, because the gun emplacements are still there. And you can, it's amazing when you stand on that cliff edge and think about those guys climbing up those cliffs.
I've had some buddies in my platoon who were out there for the anniversary, and they did a big for the 75th anniversary. They did a big climb with guys in old Ranger kit and then the new Ranger kit, which was really cool. And I wish I would have been able to be a part of that, but we only could send over like 5 or 6 dudes, and I didn't make the list.
Unlucky.
Yeah.
So we mentioned Black Hawk Down earlier on in Mogadishu, and I think for most Brits, as I said earlier, that's where they would probably recognise the Rangers being involved. And I might be talking out of turn here, but to me, if people want to know that it's sort of a classic, if there's such a thing, Ranger mission, that was probably it, where they're supporting Delta guys going in to do a snatch essentially on enemy combatants, and the Rangers were there providing the force to enable that raid to go ahead. And we'll talk about fitness and all that later on, but one thing struck me with that whole film, and I know it's just a film, but certainly the fitness side of it came out at that end where they're doing that withdrawal run back to the base because the Pakistani army, they didn't have enough vehicles to get them out. And I think, fitness there really just showed the way for that intense training that the Rangers do.
Especially after being in combat or, for a long sustained period. So you must have been exhausted anyway. And then for having to exfil on foot, that must have been a lot of pressure.
We hold an annual Mogadishu Mile event at headquarters in Benning because of that, just to kind of remember and honor the sacrifices made that day. Oh,
is that to replicate that last sort of dash out of the combat area?
Mm-hmm. They have like, I won't call them artifacts, but like they have like some of the machine guns and stuff that were actually on that mission still, and they keep them and then they run with them every year. The company of 375 that was involved in that battle, like will hold on to those, and then every year they carry those weapons in remembrance during that run.
What is the role today of the Ranger Regiment then?
Yeah, so as said earlier, we're the premier direct action raid force, and kind of like America's quick reaction force, honestly. And at all times, there's a company of Rangers that can be anywhere in the world within 18 hours. You mentioned that Black Hawk Down is kind of a classic Ranger mission, and initially, like that's kind of what we were known for, is like being Delta's blocking force. But during the GWAT and with just how large scale that kind of conflict was between Iraq and Afghanistan, we kind of came into our own in terms of being able to run our own operations and large scale raids. And we kind of, made a name for ourselves as being able to capture high value targets and do those larger platoon size or company size movements and operations, which Delta really doesn't have the capabilities of. They can do, more platoon style raids, but anything beyond that, like they're calling us for help and to be the primary on those.
Well, you can scale up, can't you? Obviously, from like you say, from a platoon or a section through to a regimental action. So you were saying there's three battalions plus you've got a new battalion. You were saying about the military intelligence.
Yeah. So we have.
What do they do?
So our MIB is. Honestly, they're pretty new, but they're basically it's regiment's attempts at creating our own internal intelligence asset, essentially, for our own targeting and our mission set, without having to rely on outside sources.
It's interesting you say about the role changing during the global war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq, because something Kevin and I have touched on for British forces is, loosely you could call it the democratisation of soldiering in the respect that prior to global war on terror, out of area operations and Argist operations were sort of the remit of the Royal Marines and the airborne forces of the Parachute Regiment in the British Army. But obviously the intensity of operations and the number of tours going round, it led to more normal, if you want, normal inverted commas regiments being put in there, and they proved that they could cope just as well as these other battalions that had traditionally been used for that role. So we did see a little bit of that effect throughout the British Army as well. The things that were used to be primarily special forces were then sort of passed down the line a little bit because they realised that other units could do them.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, one special forces unit can't do everything. You've got to pass that burden. And like Colin says, the traditional Commando Brigade and the Airborne Brigades, who are usually the rapid reaction, other people were doing it. And like you say, they skilled up and they were able to deliver effect.
So Zach, then, obviously Rangers then, as we've already established, a highly skilled unit, and to get those skills you need the right people. So what is the selection process to get into the regiment, and what is the difference between Ranger School and serving with the 75th Regiment?
Yeah, so to get into Ranger Regiment, you have to pass Ranger Assessment and Selection 1 as a junior enlisted, or Ranger Assessment and Selection 2 as a officer, or a little bit more senior enlisted. And so for me, as I went, straight in out of high school, I was obviously, like a private, E1, E2. And so I went to RASP 1. And the thing about RASP is because you're going straight to a Ranger battalion. And like I said and mentioned, like you could be anywhere in the world within 18 hours upon straight, about, right after showing up. So it's equal parts selection as well as, a bit of training to get you to a baseline of competency before you make it to your battalion. So the first 4 weeks of RASP, it's a total of 8 weeks. And the first 4 weeks are more of the selection part. You do a PT test and then other physically demanding events. There's a couple of rucks and a run that you do that are, designed to kind of weed people out. And then you're, a little bit of sleep deprivation and games by cadre. And then the second week, you do a ruck out to a remote spot on Fort Benning in Georgia called Cole Range, where you conduct 2 iterations of land nav per day, one in the morning and then one at night. And then in between that, and into the night, you're just getting smoked and playing games and getting hazed. Essentially, you don't get much sleep. You get maybe a couple hours every night, and this is where the majority of people end up quitting. This is kind of like our equivalent for Navy SEALs, like their Hell Week. This is like essentially Rangers like Hell Week. After you make it through that, you go into week 3 where you learn to fast rope and you do some medical training. This is where you learn the Ranger First Responder program, which is, what really enables our battlefield survivability, getting everyone up to a baseline knowledge of, emergency medical interventions. And then weeks 4 through 7 is when you start learning how to shoot. They kind of like swap roles and turn into more instructors than people trying to get you to quit. Because you are essentially, if you make it to this point, like your odds are very good at making it the rest of the way through. So they're being more mentoring than just trying to get you to wash out. So you learn how to shoot CQB, close quarters battle rifle and pistol, and you do a breaching week. So you learn how to manipulate breaching shotguns, mechanical tools, explosives. You learn how to build explosives, which is pretty unique that you get hands-on with those so early on in your career. And then and after that, like you graduate and you get sent to your Ranger battalion.
Listening to your podcast, you said some interesting stuff that a lot of British soldiers will be familiar with when they go on any type of selection course, in that a vast majority of the guys that you went on the course with failed themselves rather than were failed, if that makes sense. So a lot of them just mentally couldn't cope with it and withdrew. So it's interesting that that's a familiar feature in the British Army as well.
Most people end up voluntarily withdrawing or VWing, as the acronym is called. And it can fluctuate depending on the needs of the battalion. Like if a battalion's hurting for dudes, they'll be like, all right, maybe go a little bit easier on this class so they don't, wash all the way out. But I would say it averages around a 50% attrition rate. We had, I think it's 165 that you start with, and we graduated 75. So a little bit more than a 50% attrition rate. But honestly, the selection's not the hard part. Showing up to your receiving battalion is where it gets really interesting. And we like to say that selection doesn't stop, at RASP. Like you're constantly being assessed and you constantly have to keep performing. Otherwise, you're going to get the boot. So after, about a year or two of being in your unit, it's about another 50% attrition rate from the dudes who graduate. And regiment is unique in the fact that we can release people for not meeting the standard. It's called RFS. So if you don't pass PT test, or if you can't go to Ranger school and pass, we can kick you out. Basically, there's a whole litany of things that can get you kicked out, which is unique in the Army. It helps us maintain a high level of readiness and a high standard. To talk about Ranger School, so Ranger School is a school run by the Trading Command, and anyone in the U.S. military and partner military forces can attend. And it's a 60-day leadership course compared to a selection unit. So you go to Ranger School and you earn your Ranger tab, and then you go back to your unit that sent you. It's not like a selection course to try out for an elite unit. It's strictly a leadership course and a gut check.
Going back to the selection course, I think again listening to your podcast, you do something quite unique, and the only other unit I've heard do that is the Rhodesian Selous Scouts, and that's after each exercise or what training package you're doing, you get to vote on you pay a vote on the 3 best performers and the 3 worst performers. Am I correct in thinking that?
Yeah, we do that. They're called peers. We do those at the end of RASP, and yeah, like you said, you do a hierarchy of top. I think it's top 5. I want to say it's top 3 or 5, and then bottom 3 or 5, and you got to kind of explain why you pick people there, and then you also do that in Ranger School after each phase as well. And you can get dropped. Like they're very good about dropping people for people that score below. I think it's a 60% score on peers. I'm not exactly sure how it's calculated. That's cool. I didn't know that about the Cella Scouts. I want to say that there's other units in the U.S. Army that do it as well. I think that peers are part of maybe the Delta selection. Don't quote me on that. But it's something common across these kind of units to do that. Because there's limits to how much cadre can see. They can't be watching you all the time. So it kind of helps weed out the people that don't belong.
Have you heard of that in the British Army, Kev? I've not heard of that.
No, we don't do it because we obviously, on any selection course, on ours, we set a training standard. You have to meet the training standard. And the performance of a team is judged as well as the individual. If you think about when we did our course, ours was definitely select out, not training. People fail for, as you remember, some of the really basic stuff. So our selection was quite robust in clearing people out. And once you got past that phase and you went on to the training phase, it was taught as a training phase. You were expected to make mistakes as well, especially on new skills, because the only way you learn sometimes is to make mistakes. But the idea being to get the objective done.
I also found, and Zach alluded to it, and some Kev and I have talked about as well, that you get through your selection and you get to the serving unit, and there's another peer selection within the serving unit.
Yeah, definitely.
And if you don't make it within a set period of time, you establish a poor reputation as a soldier, those guys tend to leave the unit quite quickly. Is that something you saw at the Ranger units as well, Zach?
Mm-hmm. And it's maybe it's less formal at that point. So it's like an informal competition at all times. And the ones that don't hack it, they kind of get bullied. I want to say bullied, I guess, bullied out of it to where you're going to improve because you don't like being the target of your platoon's jokes and stuff, or you end up going to a support role within your company, like the arms room
Stores.
Or commo, yeah, supply. And it's like, all right, if you can't hack it, like that's where you're going to go because no one wants to be around you. Or sent to
it's the same in army. Same armies all over.
Yeah.
Same in armies all over.
Yeah.
Someone's got to manage the battery store. So Zach, once you passed the initial selection, what continuation did you do when you got to your battalion?
Yeah. So after you pass, you obviously show up and you're the new guy. You don't know anything. And people are kind of looking at you through a lens of distrust. They're like, all right, can we trust you? Like you made it through RASP, but RASP is short. So, maybe not all of your character flaws has been found out. And so it's a rough start once you show up to your battalion, once you're a private. So after you spend, roughly 6 months to a year in your battalion, if you're a good enough dude, you'll get sent to Ranger School, where you're required to pass it, basically. And if you don't pass, you might have a chance to go back, depending on the reason you failed. But if you don't and you get multiple tries, like they can kick you out for that. And most of the time, dudes pass Ranger School. Like that's not a huge issue. So once you earn your Ranger tab, which is separate from the Ranger scroll, it's kind of like earning your tenure. And it's a little bit harder to get rid of you at that point. And you've kind of proven that you're competent in you're willing to continue on. As far as the training goes, you're constantly training in the regiment. There are certain events that you have to qualify on every year. There's team level live fires, squad level live fires, and then platoon level live fires. Occasionally, you'll do company size live fires. You'll do CQB, close quarters battles training. Airfield seizures is something that is one of our key mission sets that we have to train on every single year. And we'll do those at the company as well as the battalion level. And those are a grueling couple of weeks that you dread looking forward to every year. Constantly doing this, honestly, it's almost twice a year that you'll do some of these, just based on how the training rotation and the deployment rotation goes. But that's what really makes us excellent at what we do, is because we're constantly training. And then, it's slowed down a little bit, but typically you deploy about once a year as well. So when you're not deployed or conducting any of this mandatory training, you have the opportunity to attend other Army schools outside of, Ranger Regiment, such as sniper school, dive, free fall, which is honestly pretty rare for Rangers to get. You got anti-terror, evasive driver, master breacher, and then there's a ton of other like little smaller, like week-long courses that are all really designed to increase your capabilities and lethality. And the intent is that you go to these schools and then bring that knowledge back and train up your guys below you. Is
everybody in the Rangers parachute trained?
Mm-hmm. That's technically part of the selection pipeline. Maybe not selection, but it's part of a pipeline. It used to be you'd go to airborne school prior to Ranger assessment and selection, and then they were finding out the dudes grabbed the Ranger contracts just to get the airborne school, and they'd quit. So they switched it. So now you go to RASP right after your initial training, and after you pass that, you go to airborne school, which is 3 weeks. It's a pretty simple course, really not too hard, just long and kind of silly. But everyone in the regiment is static line jump qualified.
You're getting all this good training, picking up lots of valuable qualifications. Is there much of a churn? Because I'd imagine a lot of the qualifications experience you get in the Rangers has got quite a lot of cachet in the private security industry.
I don't think as much. You don't really hear about people quitting just to go contract necessarily, because there's a lot of those contracting companies have a high degree of, because there are so many qualified candidates, they're like, all right, we want a minimum of like 6 years, which is, about average, I would say, churn rate, and then the dudes that want to try out for other units as well. Like Ranger Regiment gives a solid foundation for going to SF or trying out for a tier 1 unit.
So Zach, what in your opinion makes a Ranger? What are the characteristics required? And how, well, we've probably touched on this last part already, but how hard is the transition from the RASP to serving in the regiment?
Sure. So I think that the big defining characteristic of a Ranger is the fact that we're masters at the basics, and we call them the big 5. So marksmanship, mobility, medical, physical fitness, and then small unit tactics. And the other thing that sets them apart is the Ranger Creed, which is you recite that every day in Ranger School and RASP, and you kind of internalize it and live by it. And he's just incredibly competent and capable at everything that he does or learns. And to succeed, you got to not have any kind of quit in you, because it's going to be found out at some point. You need to be confident, and you also need to be teachable and be good at PT. If you can't keep up, it's going to be a hard time for you. But you also have to be pretty intelligent as well. You can't just be we call them strong Rangers. Like you got strong Rangers and you got smart Rangers, but you got to be both. You can't just be a strong Ranger. You got to be able to think through and not just necessarily blindly follow orders. Sometimes you got to, obviously, if you're a lower enlisted, but it helps if everyone is a thinking member of the assault force.
But we're all three of us grinning there as you're saying that. It's for civilians who are listening. You can get a strong soldier, fit soldier easily, and you can get an intelligent soldier quite easily. But getting a strong, fit, intelligent soldier, it's not, without being, I'm not trying to disparage soldiers as a profession, but it can be an elusive combination, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It is hard. And I think RASP and then just the lifestyle does well to at least develop those capabilities, or not capabilities per se, but bring out those traits in someone. So if you're, a little bit weaker on the strength side, you'll make sure to get that fixed up. And then if you're not as intelligent, like they're going to make sure they teach you how to learn, as it were. So as far as like the transition from RASP, I talked a little bit about it before, but like the op tempo is just high speed at all times. It's breakneck, and I filmed a podcast last night with some other dudes, and they mentioned and kind of described it as like regiment is like this train that's going, and you just got to jump on and hold on for dear life, because it's going regardless, and they're not going to slow down for you at all. And some dudes just can't handle it. And being a Ranger private is incredibly difficult because while you're trying to learn your job, you've got a huge spotlight on yourself being the new guy. So like you're messing up, you're making mistakes. Everyone's kind of looking at you to see if you're going to be, quitter, lazy. And everyone in the platoon that you show up to has already deployed together, has already been through all the hard stuff together. And they are very tight and cohesive. And they don't like it when someone else shows up and tries to integrate themselves in. So it's you kind of just, get hazed a bit. And they're looking to find out if you're going to be a weak link. But as soon as you pass Ranger school, and as soon as you do a couple training events and like show that you're competent and can keep up, like it kind of relaxes a little bit until you get to Ranger school. But it varies, depending on who you are as a person and how capable you are.
And I think all that can be summed up in the Rangers motto, which I am not even going to attempt to pronounce because it's Latin. So I'll leave it over to you, Zach. What is the Rangers motto? Because I think it pretty much sums up what you've discussed there.
Yeah, sua sponte. So it's a legal term meaning of one's own accord. And it basically means that like part of it is like it's a completely voluntary unit to be in. Like no one's forcing you. Like there's no Ranger draft or anything like that. It's you got to volunteer 3 times: once for the Army, once for airborne school, and once for regiment. And on the other side of that is you have to be able to make the right decisions and choose the right actions without someone holding your hand all the time or telling you what to do. And that's what makes us, another reason that makes us unique.
So Zach, with regards to weapons and equipment, do you have access to a greater variety than, say, the airborne or the other regular troops? Because
we are, a specialized role, like we do have access to a larger variety of weapons in our arms room. Especially, like attachments, like we've got the whole suite of special operations kind of equipment. M4s, we've got long barrel, or not necessarily long barrel, but regular length, and then shorty length, so like 10.5-inch M4s. We have access to the SCAR weapon system, both the 5.56 and the 7.62 versions. And then our weapons squads are outfitted with the lighter M240, so the M240 Lima, and then Mark 48s, which are basically an upsized and 7.62 saw. And then we have a multitude of optic choices for those. We have the Elcan optic series, aim points, EOTechs, whereas regular units might only have, ACOGs or, just basic red dots. And you can set your gun up however you want. Really, there's not a defined unit SOP, so there's a leeway for you as a shooter to really pick what you want, which is really, really cool. And then as far as like the personal, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking, what about support weapons, mortars and stuff like that? Do the Rangers deploy with all that sort of weapons as well?
We have our own internal mortar platoons, and we have 60 millimeter mortars, 81 millimeter mortars, and I want to say it's the 120 millimeter. 20 millimeter as well, but that's a separate, I guess, separate from the line companies. But they'll get attached out to us when we deploy, and I've done a little bit of cross training with mortars, but nothing too crazy. I definitely couldn't set one up on my own. Yeah, as far as like personal equipment goes, we've got our own issuing facility. Like you've got the regular Army issuing facility where we get some stuff, and then we have the Ranger issuing facility, and that's where we get like the cool guy gear, cryo uniforms, cry kit and plate carriers, ops corps helmets, Mr. Ranch rucksacks, and a lot of like specialized gear that just regular units you either have to pay for on your own or you don't get at all.
Oh, that's pretty good. And one thing we didn't mention, I think, I don't think it came out that well, but you can walk into a recruiting office in the States and say, I want to be a Ranger, and you can go straight in from the street. Is that correct?
Yeah. So that's what I did. I joined while I was still in high school, technically. I had my parents sign early entry waivers because I knew that's what I wanted to do. So I was, like you said, straight off the street. That's what makes it so unique is because you can get to a tier 2 unit in, at the very start of your career.
And you mentioned earlier on, Zach, that you're pretty much focused on getting in the regiment, doing a tour in the regiment, and then leaving, essentially. Was there any time when you were in the Rangers that you thought, do you know what, I could make a career out of this? Or was your mind pretty much on just having that experience and then getting out and doing something else with your life?
I think that for me, I went in with the intention of like not serving the full 20. And then as I was in, I was like, I kind of really enjoy this. I don't necessarily want to stay in regiment forever. So I came to a decision point in 2021 where it's like, all right, I either need to get out or I need to try out for one of the tier 1 units. And I came to the conclusion that trying out for one of those would be, I wouldn't say a gamble, because it is something worth doing, but it would add more time onto my timeline. And I just decided at the end of the day that I was fortunate to have done what I did, and I got the full experience out of it, I felt, and I decided to leave the service.
I'd imagine for a guy who's been in the Rangers quite a while, making that, if you want to be a career soldier, moving back to a conventional army unit would be a massive culture shock.
Mm-hmm. It's you don't really see it too much, like for that reason. Like this, after you've had a taste of the good life, it's really, really difficult to want to choose to go to a regular unit. And regiment's unique in the fact that you don't have like a maximum amount of time that you can serve. Like you can do your entire career pretty much serving with the Ranger Regiment.
So a guy could join as a private and leave as like a battalion sergeant major, that type of thing.
There's something unique with regiment in the terms of one of the charters is that the intent is for you to serve and then take your knowledge to the rest of the army. So there are a few points in your career where you do what's called broadening time, and you'll do like a year or two max with another unit, usually in kind of an instructor role, never as in like just a line role, but usually as like an instructor of some sort. And that's really your only taste of outside regimental kind of life is when you do that. Around staff sergeant E6 time is when that usually happens before you come back and become a platoon sergeant.
Yeah, we did the same, didn't we? In the British Army, we get postings, spend 2 years with the unit, and come back to our unit. Both me and Colin have done that, which was
challenging in its own right.
Yeah, massively, but massively.
We went. Me and Kev both served time in like a National Guard unit, if you like, the British equivalent of what we call our reserve forces. So, but you use the term broadening your experience. It certainly does that, and it
does. Gives
you a greater depth of how to deal with people of different capabilities, I think, as well, which when you're operating in a high performance unit, it's never normally an issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you decided to get out then, Zach, and now you've got your own business line and podcast tube. So podcast on YouTube. So basically we'll start off then. What inspired you what is your business line? What inspired you to take that up?
Yeah, so I currently run a small tactical gear manufacturing company called Rockwell Designs. I started it while I was still in during 2020 and like the pandemic, just because we had a lot of downtime from work, and I was overseas actually when I had the idea, and I kind of came up with these designs for some chest rigs for Kalashnikov and like 7.62 NATO pattern rifles, something a little different than your regular 5.56 or M4 style gear that is well, that market's well saturated. So I saw a little bit of a niche that I could get into myself. So I drew up all these designs. I bought a sewing machine and a bunch of material. And then when we came back, we had a lot of downtime due to us having to quarantine after being deployed. So we did quarantine for 2 weeks. Then we had 2 weeks of block leave, and then we had another 2-week quarantine. And I was like, I can't just sit and do nothing at home for this. Like, I need to capitalize on this somehow. And that's kind of how it got started, was that. And then it's really kind of took off this year after I got out, and I've been sewing and making product and releasing that pretty consistently throughout the year. And so, yeah, going to take a little bit of a pause just because I've reached a little bit of tracer burnout, as it were, on that. So
I noticed you went for a lot of 9. So, sorry, Zach, I noticed you went looking at your website. You've gone for a lot of 9mm rigs. I notice.
Yeah, I've got a pistol caliber carbine or a, SMG MP5 style rigs as well,
and some decent Rhodesian camouflage as well. Always looks good.
I don't think I've done the Rhodesian yet. I've got some ready to go for when I do decide to start up again. But that's a commonly requested pattern.
Yeah.
What, the Rhodesian camouflage?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Not those nutcracker shorts though.
I've got some of those. I've in some of my videos I'm wearing those, but
that's a daring look.
We did an exchange with Anglico, which is the US Marine Corps naval gunfire, and they took us out to Puerto Rico to do some naval gunfire, and it was red hot. And we had our jungle fatigues on, and these US Marines said, "We'll give you guys some shorts if you want." And we thought, yeah, okay, we'll go out there in t-shirt, shorts, and jungle boots. I'm not joking. They turned up with these shorts, man, that just barely covered your arse cheeks. No, we'll draw a line at them, guys. Thanks very much.
Yeah, no, that's those are called Ranger panties, or that's what we used to wear. Those as our uniform, like the super short, silky shorts, and then they have the like the Ranger scroll and tab on them. I have a bunch of them, honestly. Like I wear them as underwear because you can downgrade if you ever got to drop your pants. Like it's still technically a short, so it's like it's just riding that line though of like almost being too much to wear out in public.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's funny.
So what you've jumped in and set up your own business, and I think a lot of former soldiers sort of underestimate what they can bring to the civilian world. What advice would you give somebody who's wanting to set up their own business directly leaving the forces?
I would definitely say try and figure it out while you're still in. Like maximize your weekends. Like don't just turn into another boozing soldier on the weekends. Like try and develop a skill set, that you can leverage outside and kind of get it to a point where you're competent and capable enough before you get out. Definitely don't get out and like try and figure it out then, is what I would say. Either get out and like work a regular job and develop it at the same time, or try and like nurture it to a point where it will be profitable by the time that you leave. And if I were to go back and do it again, I probably would have picked something that has a little bit higher return on investment and return on time. Something that you can more effectively freelance with and make a little bit more money without as much overhead as a traditional business. Not knocking, brick and mortar businesses at all, but it is kind of a pain when I want to go and do stuff, but I'm tied to, a physical location to be running my business. So like learning like marketing skills or, digital kind of skills, I think would be a better return on investment for dudes that are looking to work for themselves. That's kind of my 2 cents. Is I'm making that shift towards that myself, to where I can work from anywhere with an internet connection and a laptop. Yeah. And don't underestimate yourself. Like, even though like if you're like, just infantry, like you still learn a lot of soft skills, as we call them, like being able to handle a huge amount of stress, which running a business is a huge amount of stress. Being able to communicate effectively, being able to, see hard things through. Like whenever I get like stumped in something, it's like, oh, at least I'm not in Ranger school. Like at least I'm not, running on 1 hour of sleep and out in the woods eating, MREs, not showering. Like it can always be worse. So like you can use your time in and use it as like a reflection point or something you can look back on and gather strength from. It's like, all right, I've done all these hard things in my past. This isn't that hard in comparison. I can keep going.
Yeah, as Kevin and I talked about this, I think former soldiers, nobody's interested if you can commit a headshot at 600 meters or call in an airstrike. It's that soft skills you're after, and it's translating them is the important bit. And I think a lot of soldiers get that terribly wrong on their move out and seem a bit puzzled as why nobody's interested in what they did.
Mm-hmm.
It's a confidence thing when you leave one sort of, especially if you've been in a long time. You lack confidence, perhaps. when you leave because you're unsure about, if you've done 20 odd years in the forces, you institutionalise, you're happy where everything is, and then all of a sudden you're in a wider world. Most people aren't that interested in your bore stories, as we call them, and you've got to try and reinvent yourself a little bit and find those skills that are transferable, which is always difficult, and try and convert them into a language that they can understand. And don't get frustrated that they don't understand you.
Yeah, which they do invariably.
Yeah.
So, Zach, you've got a podcast, the Danger Ranger podcast. Can you tell people a little bit about that and where they can find it?
Yeah, sure. So I started a podcast on a kind of a whim. Like, it's always a joke among a lot of my friends. Like, oh, let's do it. Let's start a podcast. And I was like, what if I actually did though? So I kind of did it on a whim. I bought some equipment and I just started talking about my experiences, and it kind of blew up from there. And then in September I did like a daily video challenge where I recorded not necessarily a podcast, but other Ranger stories or stuff that I was working on or going to the range, and gained a lot of traction doing that actually. And so I'm going to continue on doing that. You can find it, I think you said the Danger Ranger podcast. I think if you just search that on YouTube, should pop up. And then I have a couple Instagram pages. My business page is at Rockwell Designs Actual, and then my personal one is at the Zach Allred.
And I'll post links on the show notes when we release this podcast as well, so you can directly link to Zach's social media stuff.
Well, we come to that point of the podcast. As usual, we finish off with Desert Island Dits, which is obviously Zach's choice of book, his film and luxury item. So for this episode, Zach, what have you chosen?
All right. So for books, I'm going to have to go with probably my favorite book of all time, Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, which is a novel about a gang of scalp hunters on the Texas-Mexico border in the 1800s. Kind of a dark book, but it's one that's very well written, has a lot of layers to it. And I honestly, have probably read it more than a couple dozen times at this point. So having that would be cool. Film choice. This one's a hard one. I got a lot of favorites, but it's probably have to be Heat, which is a heist movie with Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Val Kilmer. Some good gunfights in that for anyone who hasn't seen it. They actually use a portion of that movie to teach or to demonstrate proper bounding techniques and mag changes and such. And luxury item.
Who choreographed that, Zach?
I think it was a Brit.
Choreographed Andy McNabb of Bravo 20 fame.
Okay.
X-22 SAS.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, he did a great job.
Yeah, no, it's a really good film. If anybody hasn't seen it, it's really good. That last scene at the end is pretty cool.
Yeah, they're making a Heat 2, which I read the book, and hopefully it's as well produced as the first. And then luxury item.
If they're using Pacino and De Niro, they're going to be wheelchairs.
I don't think so, because they're all old. Val Kilmer can barely talk too, so I think they're going to have to do a little bit of a recast, unfortunately, which is fine. That happens because it is an older movie.
Plus, they were all killed in Heat at the end anyway.
That's a good point.
They'll have a problem, bring them back.
Well, it's interesting because they do in the book, I'm not going to spoil it for anyone, but it's partially before the events of the actual movie, and then there's stuff in the post part of it. So they would maybe have to bring some of the dead back, but
because interesting, I listened to quite a few books on Audible, and I saw Heat 2 advertised on Audible. So would you recommend it as a book to listen to as well?
Yeah, it was good. I couldn't put it down. I'm sure the audiobook's great, but I would definitely recommend it. If you liked Heat, you'll appreciate Heat 2.
Sorry, I jumped in there and interrupted you.
No, well.
iPod loaded with music. I'm a big fan of music, and I feel like that would help out being stuck on an island.
iPods? Do we still have iPods?
I think so. I mean, I would say phone. Some kind of device that holds a large amount of files.
I'm not a technical expert, by the way.
No,
Colin will
Stein.
adhere to.
So, what sort of music would you have on it, Zach?
Well, I like everything, honestly. Like I've got a wide variety. I like heavy metal. I like a little bit of country, some rap, classical. Like there's a wide range. My playlists give people a little bit of whiplash because it'll go from like Slayer and then like to like Lana Del Rey or something.
I love it. I like a bit of Lana, must admit.
Colin,
She's great.
your book.
So, to keep the Ranger sort of theme going, my choice is Robert's Ridge by Malcolm McPherson. And this operation took place in March 2002 during Operation Anaconda, where small recce teams established observation posts in strategic locations in Afghanistan and directed US air power against enemy targets. And during this op, a small US force fought a 17-hour battle on the mountaintop of Takur Ghar, which came also be known as Robert's Ridge. And this was fought in the winter at 10,000 feet, so they had altitude to contend with as well. And about 0100 hours on March the 4th, Razor 03, a US Army MH-47E helicopter, tried to insert a team on top of the mountain, unaware it was an enemy stronghold. And you do a bit of digging behind the scenes now. It comes out that it's a bit like Arnhem in that they had aerial photography of the mountaintop. They could visibly see positions and enemy movement tracks between these positions, but somehow nobody clicked on that it was still heavily fortified and the mission went ahead, and with disastrous results. So while the chopper was landing, it was hit by RPG and gunfire, causing a US Navy SEAL, Neil Roberts, to fall from the helicopter. The crew managed to get the aircraft out and made an emergency landing about 3 miles away, and USAF Combat Controller Technical Sergeant John Chapman began coordinating close air support in the rescue effort to retrieve Roberts, who had fallen out of the heli. Another helicopter, Razor 4, picked up the team and took them back to rescue Roberts on a 10,000-foot mountaintop. So a lot of this footage, some of it's on YouTube as well, which is quite unusual. And you can see Chapman leaving the helicopter and charging up the hill through the snow. This is obviously from a drone, and taking the fight to the enemy while under heavy fire from 3 directions. He killed 2 enemy in a fortified position, and he returned fire, killing them both. But almost immediately, the team began taking machine gun fire from another fortified position 12 metres away. But Chapman deliberately moved into open to gauge the new enemy position, and it was then he was hit and critically injured but continued fighting. But for over an hour, he engaged multiple enemy fighters before being fatally wounded. And he's credited with saving the lives of his teammates and was awarded posthumously the Medal of Honor and promoted to Master Sergeant. And this is where the Rangers came in. The QRF heli Razor 1 arrived carrying a Ranger team and 4 Air Force personnel. And again, as it was landing, it was hit with multiple RPGs and small arms fire that immediately killed and wounded several of those on board. And they continued the fight on for another, basically overnight. And in the book, again, comes back to that fitness piece, which always strikes me in dismounted small team operations. There's a Delta Force guy led a number of Rangers up that mountainside to get to that position, and they're ploughing through knee-deep snow at altitude, and the description of that going up there is quite graphic, and how much, even though those guys are extremely fit, how much it actually took it out of them. And about 8:15 p.m. the following day, helicopters came in and managed to extract them. At one point, they wouldn't send extra helicopters in because they were deemed that it was too dangerous and they might lose more helicopters. So those guys were basically fighting overnight in hellish conditions against a very determined enemy. And an after-action view was able to identify comms and command problems that dogged the effort from the beginning. And there was as a result, there was a revision on how such operation would be conducted in the future. There are multiple bravery awards. And certainly the Rangers lived up to the motto "Sua Sponte." Is that right, Zach? Sua Sponte?
Sua Sponte, yeah.
So Sua Sponte that we described earlier on. So again, Zach, is that a battle that's discussed much within the Ranger battalions, or it's become a focus of the book and it's just sort of just there in the background somewhere?
No, absolutely. So the Rangers that actually were on that QRF were from the company that I was with. And we remember them. We call them our Airborne Rangers in the Sky. So we lost Sergeant Bradley Croce, Corporal Matthew Commons, and Specialist Mark Anderson during that battle. So it's something that we keep. We're very, like I said earlier, we're very proud of our lineage, and we try and remember at least the names of the fallen. As the years go on, maybe details of the battle phase, people that were directly involved, get out of the service and stuff. But it's, it is something that we do try and remember and honor, the sacrifice of those men during these kind of, large profile or higher profile events.
Yeah, it's well worth a read, that book, because it does, as a graphic description of some really hard soldiering. So what's your choice, Kev?
My choice is Fergal Keane's book, Letters Home. Fergal Keane's the reporter for the BBC. And in his book, he talks about, he did a book earlier called Letter to Daniel, which is his son, and he talks about his experiences as a journalist in war zones. And Letters Home very much is a collection of that, again, talking about Bosnia, Sierra Leone, other parts in Africa. But leading on to that, he recently did a documentary as well. He was going to be doing some reporting on the Ukraine war. But he was talking about PTSD, because as we forget about reporters sometimes, they're in the thick of it. They see as much as we do in the armed forces. And cumulatively, they are affected by what they see. And he describes PTSD in his book as well, or the stresses of what he's seen and how he's dealing with it today, and how he's still able to go back to places like Ukraine and such like. But obviously the trauma of everything he saw, and trying to open up to people, because as a journalist, they're exactly the same boat, I suppose, as we. No one wants to admit that they're having problems, because that's his job. And he wants to report. And like servicemen, it can become addictive, because obviously operations are also addictive. And that's something I think we're all aware of, that you always want to go on another operation and another deployment. And you don't realise you're addicted to it, but you are. And you miss it when you don't go. And you're always thinking, oh, someone else has gone. You're always thinking, whoa, it's our turn. Do you know if that makes any sense? So I thought his book was quite good on that, and like I say, the recent documentary, he opened up about it, and he is brutally honest, and it's worth watching the documentary. It's worth reading those books as well.
Yeah, I saw that documentary. It was really good. Actually, it hit home quite well. So we're approaching the end of the year. Zach's episode will be out in November, so you'll be listening to it in November. But I just thought I'd give a heads up to listeners on where we're going next. So we've got a Royal Engineers podcast coming up. Kev, what's that one about?
It's the Royal Engineers. It's a specialist search. It starts off a little bit of history about the Royal Engineers, talking about their conventional role, but how they've evolved into the 21st century. And they provide some very niche capabilities, especially on things on counter-terrorism and other capabilities on searches. So they provide a lot more support to the civilian law enforcement agencies than they ever did before. So hopefully we'll get an insight into that.
Cool. And we've also got Liz McConaughey coming on. Liz is shamefully our first female service person to come on the podcast. And she was the first Chinook crew chief, served multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it'll be interesting to hear about her experiences with that regard. She was also on the medical evacuation teams in Afghanistan. So some, those teams out there did some really great job, and it'll be interesting to hear about her account from that. A bit of light relief coming up to Christmas. We've got James Lee, who wrote a book called Licking the Taliban's Flip-Flop. And James had one of the less, I'm trying to think of a great word, well, to help me out here, Kev, he was a mover in the Royal Logistics Corps, so he worked at Kandahar.
Less sort of role.
That's the word I was looking for.
In operational environments.
That's the one. Less glamorous, but no less essential, because not everybody can be in the SAS or whatever. So James's book's fantastic read. We'll be doing reading excerpts from that, and we'll be talking about his book and some of the absurdities of being in the army and operations. But that's it for another episode. So, Zach, thanks for coming on the podcast, mate, and enlightening us about the Rangers. It was a really good listen. Thank you.
Absolutely.
No, thank you, Zach.
It was an honour.
For that.
And another thanks to our listeners again for the continued support and suggestions. We've just achieved a landmark of 100,000 downloads. We've got a bit to catch up with Zach on YouTube because he's far better looking than us, and he puts his face on there. We're too old and ugly to do that. But we've got 40,000 views on our YouTube channel, so we're doing not too bad. I'll post links to Zach's YouTube channel, company website, all the rest of it on our show notes so people can click easily to that and look him up. Go have a look at his YouTube stuff. It's really good. I learned a lot on that as well, prep for this podcast. You can find us in all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. If you download from iTunes or Spotify, please give us a review. That helps us spread the news about the podcast. And finally, thanks again to Nick Beale for his continued support to the series and offering technical help through his company ISAR. And we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.